January 17, 1943. Somewhere over the Solomon Sea. The sky is a canvas of unbroken blue, stretching endlessly above the churning waters, where the Pacific swallows hold the wreckage of empires. At 25,000 feet, the air is thin and cold, the kind of cold that seeps through fleece-lined jackets and settles into bone. Lieutenant Takeo Okumura sits in the cramped cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0, scanning the horizon with eyes trained to catch the smallest irregularity in the clouds. He has been flying for 90 minutes, pushing the absolute limit of his fighter's range, and his fuel gauge already tilts toward the red. Below him, the green smudge of Bougainville Island grows larger, a promise of safety, of ground beneath his feet. He is returning from yet another escort mission, another day of shepherding slow-moving bombers through hostile skies, always conscious of the ticking clock, the dwindling fuel, the narrow margin between survival and the sea. And then, impossibly, he sees them, twin-boomed silhouettes, sleek and predatory, rising from the south like apparitions. At first, Okumura thinks his eyes deceive him. It is simply not possible. Not here. Not this far from any Allied base. The Americans do not have the range. They cannot. He has been told this, trained on this principle, built his entire tactical understanding around the unshakable truth that Japanese fighters own the deep Pacific. That distance is their fortress, their moat, their guarantee of dominance. Yet there they are, for American fighters, their distinctive twin tails unmistakable even at distance, climbing with a speed and confidence that makes his breath catch. They are not lost. They are not scattered remnants limping home. They are hunting. The P-38 Lightnings close the distance in seconds, and Okumura's radio explodes with panicked voices, his squadron breaking, scattering, suddenly transformed from hunters to prey. He banks hard, feels the G-forces crush him into his seat, watches his fuel needle drop another notch. The Americans do not turn back. They press the attack with a ferocity that speaks of full tanks, of ours still available to them, of a luxury Japanese pilots have not known since the war's first months. One of his wingmen spirals toward the sea, trailing black smoke. Another simply vanishes in a bloom of orange fire. And still the twin-boom devils remain, circling, patient, as if they have all the time in the world. Because they do. To understand the shock that ripples through Okumura's mind in those desperate seconds, one must first understand what the Zero represented to Japan, and what it had achieved. When the Mitsubishi A6M entered service in 1940, it was nothing less than a revolution, a fighter that could fly farther, climb faster, and turn more tightly than anything the Western powers possessed. Its range of nearly 2,000 miles allowed Japanese forces to strike deep into enemy territory, to appear where they were not expected, to dominate vast swaths of the Pacific that other nations considered unreachable. In the opening year of the Pacific War, Zero pilots became legends, swatting Allied fighters from the sky with contemptuous ease, their aircraft a symbol of Japanese technical prowess and tactical superiority. American and British pilots who encountered them early on filed reports that read like horror stories. An enemy fighter that could outmaneuver anything, that seemed to materialize from nowhere, that controlled the battlefield simply by virtue of being able to stay in the fight longer than anyone else. Range was not merely a tactical advantage. It was a philosophical statement. Japan, resource-poor and stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, had built its entire naval air strategy around the ability to project power across distance. The Zero embodied this doctrine perfectly. Its lightweight construction, its carefully calculated fuel economy, its willingness to sacrifice armor and self-sealing tanks for endurance, these were not oversights but deliberate choices, expressions of a military culture that prized reach above protection, that believed in the spiritual strength of the warrior to compensate for material vulnerability. For Japanese pilots, the Zero's range was proof that will and ingenuity could overcome industrial disadvantage, that a smaller nation could compete with giants if it remained clever and committed. And then, in the span of 18 months, that entire paradigm shattered. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was never supposed to exist, or rather, it was never supposed to work. When the Army Air Corps issued its 1937 specification for a high-altitude interceptor capable of extreme performance. Most manufacturers dismissed the requirements as fantasy. A fighter that could exceed 400 miles per hour, climb to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes, and maintain combat effectiveness at altitudes where other aircraft gasped and stalled. Lockheed's solution was radical to the point of lunacy, a twin-engine design, with the pilot housed in a central nacelle between two booms, each containing an Allison V1710 engine turning a counter-rotating propeller. Critics called it ungainly, overcomplicated, a maintenance nightmare waiting to happen. The prototype that first flew in January 1939 seemed to confirm their doubts, crashing on a cross-country speed attempt after running out of fuel. But Lockheed's engineers persisted, and what emerged from their refinements was something unprecedented: a fighter that could climb like a rocket, dive like a hawk, and fly missions that redefined the very concept of tactical reach. The twin-engine configuration, initially seen as a liability, became the Lightning's greatest strength, with two Allisons burning carefully calibrated fuel mixtures. The P-38 could carry internal tanks holding 300 gallons, supplemented by external drop tanks that pushed total capacity to over 400 gallons. This gave the aircraft an operational radius exceeding 700 miles in some configurations. With careful fuel management, pilots reported ranges approaching 900 miles. They could fly from bases in New Guinea to targets deep in the Solomon Islands, spend 30 minutes in combat, and return home with fuel to spare. For the first time in the Pacific War, American fighters possessed a range that matched, and then exceeded, that of their Japanese opponents. The numbers alone do not capture the psychological impact. Japanese intelligence officers, reviewing reports of P-38 encounters, initially dismissed them as exaggerations or misidentifications. It was simply not possible. They reasoned, for a fighter of such size and weight, the Lightning outweighed the Zero by more than 3 tons to possess such endurance. American fighters were known quantities, short-ranged, brutish, dependent on ground-based logistics. The P-38 violated these assumptions so completely that even facing the evidence, many commanders refused to believe it. Pilots like Okumura, confronting Lightnings hundreds of miles from the nearest American base, experienced a kind of cognitive dissonance, a collision between what they had been taught and what their eyes witnessed. If the Americans could reach this far, what other certainties might prove false? The tactical implications cascaded outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Japanese air operations in the South Pacific had been predicated on geography as defense bases, positioned just beyond the reach of Allied fighters, allowing bombers to operate with minimal escort, permitting reconnaissance flights deep into enemy territory without fear of interception. The P-38 collapsed that distance overnight. Suddenly, no Japanese base within 700 miles of an Allied airfield was safe. Bomber formations that once flew with token escorts now required massive fighter screens, draining resources and limiting offensive capability. Reconnaissance aircraft, previously able to loiter and observe at leisure, now faced the constant threat of long-range interception. The Americans were not merely matching Japanese range, they were inverting the power dynamic, turning Japan's own strategy against it. And the Lightning brought more than just range. Its twin engines provided redundancy. A single engine hit did not mean certain death, as it did in the Zero. Its heavy armament for 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose for devastating accuracy, could shred Japanese aircraft in seconds. Its speed in a dive exceeded 500 miles per hour, faster than any Japanese fighter could follow. Pilots discovered they could attack, disengage at will, climb back to altitude, and attack again, always holding the initiative, always choosing the terms of engagement. The Zero's legendary maneuverability meant nothing if it could not force the Lightning to turn, and Lightning pilots, trained in the energy-fighting tactics of the boom and zoom, rarely obliged. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Lynch, AP-38 ace with the 5th Air Force, described the aircraft's impact in a letter home. "We can go anywhere now, places that used to be sanctuaries, where the Japanese felt safe because they knew we couldn't reach them. Those are all in play now. You can see it in how they fly. They're hesitant. They're looking over their shoulders. They know we might be there, even when logic says we shouldn't be. Lynch would later die, flying a Lightning on a long-range escort mission, but his words captured a fundamental truth. The P-38 had not merely extended American reach. It had colonized Japanese consciousness, planting doubt where certainty had once flourished. There's a photograph, grainy and faded, taken at Dobodura Airfield in New Guinea, sometime in early 1943. In it, a row of P-38 Lightnings sits on the Marston matting, their twin tails casting long shadows in the equatorial sun. Ground crews swarm around them, refueling, rearming, checking the complex turbo-superchargers that allow the aircraft to maintain power at altitude. In the foreground, barely visible, a pilot leans against his canopy, helmet off, smoking a cigarette with the casual confidence of a man who knows he owns the sky. Behind him, barely discernible in the distance, is the green wall of jungle that has swallowed so many men and machines. That has defined this theater's savage character. The juxtaposition speaks volumes. American industrial power, American logistical genius, projected into the most remote and hostile environment imaginable, making it routine. For Japanese pilots, encounters with the Lightning became object lessons in American abundance. It was not merely that the aircraft existed, but that they existed in such numbers, flying such distances, expending ammunition and fuel with a profligacy that seemed almost obscene. Where Japanese fighters rationed every bullet, every drop of gasoline, Lightning pilots spoke casually of spraying targets, of making multiple attack runs, of having enough fuel to loiter and search for targets of opportunity on the return flight. This was not just technological superiority. It was philosophical difference made manifest. America fought as if resources were infinite, as if the ocean were not an obstacle but a highway, as if distance itself could be conquered through sheer material will. The contrast extended beyond combat. American pilots in the Southwest Pacific ate meals that Japanese soldiers would have considered impossible. Luxuries canned meat, fresh bread when available, coffee in quantities that seemed wasteful. They received regular mail, new equipment, replacement aircraft. When a P-38 suffered engine trouble, it was often easier to replace the entire power plant than to repair it. A casual disposal of complex machinery that Japanese maintenance crews, nursing ancient engines with hand-fabricated parts, found incomprehensible. This abundance was not incidental to American tactical success. It was foundational. The P-38's range existed not merely because of clever engineering, but because American logistics could deliver thousands of gallons of high-octane fuel to remote jungle airstrips, could maintain complex aircraft in primitive conditions, could treat the impossible as merely difficult. The mythology of the Zero had always carried within it the seeds of its own undoing. By prioritizing range and maneuverability above all else, Japanese designers had created an aircraft that was, in many ways, a consumable, fragile, vulnerable, dependent on pilot skill to compensate for structural weakness. As the war progressed and experienced pilots died, the Zero's vulnerabilities became liabilities that no amount of Bushido spirit could overcome. The P-38, by contrast, embodied a different philosophy, overwhelming capability married to survivability, the assumption that pilots were valuable resources to be protected, that aircraft should bring their crews home. This difference in design philosophy reflected a deeper difference in how each nation valued human life, how each nation conceptualized the relationship between warrior and machine. Japanese after-action reports from 1943 and 1944 read like chronicles of cascading disillusionment. Pilots described feeling hunted even hundreds of miles from Allied bases, of watching helplessly as lightnings appeared at impossible distances, of the sickening realization that fuel constraints now favored the enemy. One captured document, recovered from Rabaul after its fall, contains a passage that cuts through tactical jargon to reach something like existential despair. The twin-tailed American fighter appears everywhere. We are told our bases are beyond their range, but they come regardless. We are told to avoid combat and preserve strength, but they give us no choice. We are told victory is certain, but the sky fills with enemy aircraft while our numbers dwindle. How does one fight an enemy who can be everywhere? Who wastes fuel and ammunition as if they cost nothing? Who treats the ocean as if it were a pond? The question was rhetorical, but history provided an answer. You do not. You cannot. When range ceases to be a sanctuary, when distance no longer protects, when the fundamental assumptions underlying your strategy prove false, you lose not through any single battle but through the slow erosion of possibility itself. April 18, 1943, 16 P-38. Lightnings depart from Guadalcanal on a mission that will become legend. Their target, a Japanese transport aircraft carrying Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, touring forward bases near Bougainville, location 430 miles from the American airfield, well beyond what Japanese planners considered the danger zone. The mission requires perfect navigation over open ocean, precise timing, and fuel management calculated to the minute. The Lightnings arrive exactly on schedule, intercept Yamamoto's flight, and send the Admiral's aircraft plummeting into the jungle. They return to Guadalcanal with 2 aircraft lost but mission accomplished, having flown over 1,000 miles total, having reached out across an ocean to strike a target that should have been untouchable. The raid's success was tactical, but its significance was symbolic. The P-38 had done more than kill an admiral. It had demonstrated that no one, nowhere in the Pacific, was safe from American reach. Japanese forces, already reeling from losses at Guadalcanal and in New Guinea, now faced the psychological burden of knowing that their commanders, their bases, their supply lines all existed at American sufferance, vulnerable to attack from aircraft that seemed to operate without constraint. The Lightning became, in Japanese military consciousness, a symbol of American technological and industrial supremacy, a physical manifestation of the widening gap between what Japan could produce and what America could deploy. For American forces, the aircraft represented vindication proof that innovation and resources could overcome geography, that the vast Pacific could be mastered through engineering excellence and logistical competence. Pilots spoke of their Lightnings with an affection bordering on reverence, personalizing their aircraft, naming them, treating them as partners rather than mere tools. This bond reflected confidence, the assurance that their machine would carry them into danger and bring them home. That American industry stood behind them with replacement parts, fuel, ammunition, everything needed to sustain the fight. The P-38's range was not just a number on a specification sheet. It was a promise, a guarantee that American pilots would never be abandoned, never be left without support, never face the desperate fuel calculations that haunted their Japanese counterparts. In the end, the story of the P-38, Lightning in the Pacific, is not merely a story of technical achievement, though the aircraft's capabilities were remarkable. It is a story about the collision of ideologies, about what happens when a military built around scarcity and spiritual strength confronts an opponent whose defining characteristic is material abundance. The Lightning did not win the war. No single weapons system ever does, but it represented something more profound than tactical advantage. It embodied the American approach to conflict, the belief that problems could be solved through resources and ingenuity. That distance was just another engineering challenge, that the proper response to limitation was not acceptance but innovation. For pilots like Lieutenant Okumura, who survived that January encounter over the Solomon Sea only to die 6 months later in a futile defensive rabble, the Lightning came to symbolize a truth too painful to fully acknowledge, that Japan's early victories had been built on temporary advantages, that the enemy's industrial capacity would eventually overwhelm all spiritual resistance, that the war's outcome had perhaps never been in doubt. In his final letter home, recovered decades later from a family archive, Okumura wrote, "We see them every day now, the twin-tailed fighters. They fly as if the ocean is nothing, as if distance does not exist. I wonder sometimes if we ever truly understood what we were challenging, if our leaders comprehended the depth of the enemy's resources. We were taught that spirit conquers material, But how does Spirit fight when the enemy appears from nowhere, attacks at will, and vanishes before we can respond? I do not know if I will survive this war, but I know that these questions will outlast me. They did. The questions Okumura asked in his final days echo across decades, relevant not just to that particular conflict, but every confrontation between asymmetric powers, every moment when reach and capability redefine the possible. The P-38 Lightning, with its ungainly twin booms and counter-rotating propellers, with its extraordinary range and devastating firepower, changed more than tactics. It changed perception. It transformed distance from fortress to illusion, turned the vast Pacific from protective barrier to conquered territory, demonstrated that in modern warfare, geography itself could be made obsolete by sufficient will and resources. And so the Lightning flew on, through 1943 and 1944 and into 1945, ranging across the Pacific with impunity. Its presence a constant reminder that the old certainties had crumbled, that the future belonged to those who could project power without limit, who could turn the impossible into routine, who could make even the sky itself seem small. For the pilots who flew it, the aircraft was freedom, the freedom to go anywhere, fight anywhere, to never be constrained by fuel or distance or fear. For those who faced it, it was inevitability, the inescapable proof that they fought not just an enemy but an entire industrial civilization, one that had translated its abundant resources into absolute aerial dominance. In the end, that was the Lightning's true range, not 700 miles or 900 miles, but the distance between two worlds, two philosophies, two visions of what war could be. And when those worlds collided at 25,000 feet over the Pacific, when Japanese pilots looked up to see twin-boom silhouettes where none should exist, they witnessed not just a technological surprise but the future itself, arriving early, arriving everywhere, arriving without mercy or retreat. The sky had changed ownership, and no amount of courage or skill could reclaim it. Only acceptance remained, and the long fall toward defeat, measured one impossible encounter at a time.